was Ka, of course, and my mother was Ojibwe a little bit. And she grew up on the White Earth Reservation in Mahnomen, Minnesota, but mostly in town. She was in the town of Mahnomen. And of course, my dad was around Newkirk. He grew up on Grandma's allotment farm. And I believe that they were both in Indian service on the West Coast, which Indian service back then I think is what the BIA is today. I think that's true. He had a sister in Portland, Oregon, and she had a sister in Seattle. So they were out there. I mean, they had family, and so I was born in Portland, Oregon. And then when I was 5 years old, my father moved us from Portland, Oregon to Pawhuska, Oklahoma. So quite a change. And of course, you know, I was 5 years old, and it was okay with me. I grew up Catholic. Seems like every tribe had a church associated with it, missionaries or whatever. Grandma was Catholic. My mom was Catholic. My dad was Catholic. So.
And what was your grandmother's name?
My grandmother's name was Lucy Taya Eads. And she was the first woman chief of the Kaw from 1922 to 1934. Well, I know when we moved to Pawhuska, we were there three years, and I would go to powwows with her, and she always helped with the cooking and the cleanup, and so I was aware, you know, that we were Native. My friends, I went to Catholic school, and there were a lot of Osage people there, since Pawhuska is the Osage capital. And so my close friends, playmates were Osage, and so it was, you know, I knew we were Native. Of course, Grandma was full-blood Potawatomi, and her brother also lived in Pawhuska. He was full-blood. So I knew, but, you know, I didn't really. She was just Grandma. She was a strong woman. She always took charge of things. She, you know, you go to a powwow and she would say, "Now don't run around, and, you know, respect your elders." Yes, Grandma. And she had really long hair. I don't think she ever cut it after she had gone to school in Haskell, where she had to cut it. And so at night she would take it down. She always had it wrapped up during the day, and take it down at night, and I got to brush it. And I wish I could remember more of what we talked about when I was doing that. But
what do you feel you've learned from her?
Oh, I think I've learned more from her recently than I did as a child. When I decided to tell her story, I, of course, did research. Jim Pepper Henry had just started the Kansa Museum at Kaw City, Oklahoma, and he said, "I'm going to do an article on your grandma and put her on the cover of the newsletter, and I want you to write the story." And this was in the early 90s. And like, okay. And so I started researching and reaching out to cousins, that I hadn't seen for years. And, what do you remember of Grandma? And I picked up some good stories from them, and I knew more about her life then. So I don't think I realized as a child, that she was a chief even. My father had collected documents pertaining to her and Chief Washunga, who adopted her and her brother when they were small. One cousin said, "Oh, yes, I remember visiting Grandma in Lawrence." And she would hear Crow go, "Caw, caw, caw." And she would say, "Yes, I know a caw." So I always used that in my presentation I did of her.
How was she perceived in the white newspapers?
Oh my. Queen of the cause. And she was elected in 1922, and women had just gotten the right to vote in 1920. So it was kind of a big deal, and they're being the first woman chief of the Kaw, and a mother and wife, and she had 7 children by then, and she 37 years old, and she was kind of a big deal, I think. She was trained as a nurse at Haskell, and her very first job, they sent her to New York City at a training hospital, a German training hospital in Brooklyn. And so she was in New York City for a while. That's where she got married. She married her first husband there. She had actually met him in Lawrence, and he followed her out there and convinced her that they needed to get married. And then she got pregnant, and she's like, okay, I want to go back to Lawrence to have my baby. So they packed up and headed back to Kansas, and she ended up having twins. And one of them started having seizures and wasn't healthy. And then she found out she was pregnant again. And she's like, oh my, I need to, I've been living as a white woman, but I really need my Kaw family. And so they moved back to the Kaw reservation. And her husband didn't like that life, and he ended up leaving. And then she met my grandpa, John Eads, who was English and Scottish, I believe, and he had traded with the Kaw people for years. He had a store in Newkirk, and he could speak Kansa better than she could, even because, she hadn't been allowed to speak it at Haskell, and he had been trading with the people for years. And so they married and had 6 children. So she had 3 with her first husband and 6 with John. And my father was their oldest son.
What have you learned through all this process?
Oh, what have I learned? So much. I've always been active in the Native community in Wichita. I worked at the Mid-America All Indian Center when it first opened in 1976, and so I knew a lot of Native people in Wichita, but I really didn't know the Kaw people because my dad died when I was 14, and of course my mom was she was alone and trying to raise 4 kids, and we all went to work, all got jobs, and so it was, I never really concentrated on my Kaw heritage that much. I think in the 1970s, there was kind of a revival of interest in Native Americans. And
Well, for all cultures, really, I think, and maybe I'm wrong, but Alex Haley's Roots had come out.
Mhm.
That was a big hit on TV, and people began looking at their own family histories, no matter what culture.
Yes,
And it was okay to talk about it.
It was. Yes, because my dad's generation, he was half, and that was a bad thing
It was forbidden.
in his day. It was, if you could pass for white, you were much better off.
Mm-hmm.
And I said something to my daughter recently, who's blonde and green-eyed, and I said something about passing this on to you, and she's like, I don't even look Indian. And I'm like, well, it's not how you look. I'm like, that's what I always thought. I thought, I don't look Native American.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't matter. It's what's in your heart, and it's my heritage. So I decided to embrace it, and so I've learned a lot from the Native community in Wichita, and then when I retired 10 years ago, and I decided to tell my grandma's story. I had seen Joyce Thayer do a Calamity Jane performance at the Commission in Council Grove, and she rode in on a horse and got off and I thought, oh my gosh, I was just enthralled. And I would run into her at Santa Fe Trail events because my husband is a member of the Santa Fe Trail Association, and we'd be on the bus together, and I'm like, I have a story to tell. And she said, what is that? And so I told her about my grandma, and she's like, oh, well, you have to tell that story. She said, people need to hear that. And I'm like, oh, okay. Well, being the shy introvert, I'm like, there's no way I can do that. Like, I couldn't do what you do. And she said, yes, you can. She said, I'm shy too. She said, I had, but I found it's easier if you're in character and you're somebody else, and you can, it takes over, and you don't. And I thought, well, okay, maybe I can do that. So when I retired, I joined the Kaw Cultural Committee because I wanted to be closer to the Kaw people and learn the culture from them. So I served on the Cultural Committee for 4 years, and I remember I was taking the workshop from Joyce there at the time, and I said, well, when I get this script ready, I want to do it for you guys to make sure that I give everything right. I said, I don't want to make anybody mad. One woman looked at me and she says, you're going to make somebody mad. So I didn't realize then, that there's, even in Native communities, there's politics and there's, all sorts of things. It's just kind of like, so I think that was my first lesson. And there was a lot I didn't know. And so, of course, I was helping with powwows and cultural events and learning. And then when that was over, I hadn't really had time to do my story of my grandmother. So when that was over, I decided to get that script out and brush it off and start. And so I wasn't even ready, but I had talked to Joyce and I said, well, I have a script. And she's like, oh, okay, well, we're going to be in Cowtown in March or April. And she said, we'll be training some of the people at Cowtown. And she said, you can come and do a performance for us. And I'm like, I said, I don't know that I'm ready. I don't have a costume. I haven't ever done it. She said, well, you got to start somewhere. And she said, this would be a perfect place to start. So that's what happened. And the more that I did Chief Lucy of the Kaw Indian performance, the more I realized that the people in Kansas, some were aware of Kaw history and Kansa people, but they there had never been that much interaction with Kaw people. And a lot of Kaw people weren't willing to come to Kansas and tell their stories. It was just, it's like they kicked us out. Why would we go back there? But being a Kaw in Kansas was a little different for me. I almost felt like I had an obligation or a responsibility to teach people, even though I didn't want to at all. And my husband would say, if you don't tell the story, who's going to tell it? Well, you never know which one of these students you're going to touch. And yes, and I found that was true. You don't know. And if you don't tell the story, you really don't know. I mean, people don't know. The Kaw people migrated west ahead of European migration in probably the 1600s, and there were 5 tribes that left the Ohio River Valley area, is one theory. I don't think anybody really knows, but it was the Yeehaw Siouan speaking people, and it was the Kaw, Ponca, Omaha, Quapaw, and Kansa. So they traveled west, and the first break off was in the Mississippi River. The Quapaw people went south. They started breaking off then again at the Missouri River, and the Ponca and the Omaha, as they were called, went north. The Osage and the Kansa were together the longest. And so those 5 tribes, our culture and language is all very similar, and especially the Osage and the Kansa, because they were together the longest. And then they did break off at the Osage, at Osage Creek. I think the Osage went south and the Kansa went north.
They were the first people that Lewis and Clark saw when they came through Kansas.
Yes, except they weren't there. Lewis and Clark were told.
Their village was.
Their village was. Lewis and Clark were told, the Kansa people are in Kansas, and they have a village, Donovan County area now. It's around Atchison. And so they have a village up there, and so they went there, and nobody was home. The village was there, but the people were out on a hunt. So they were the first tribe that Lewis and Clark didn't meet. But in the 1600s, I believe, the first map maker for the Long expedition recorded a Kansa village in Kansas, and so we were known as Kansa. In our language, it's Kanse, and the second syllable is barely audible. So even in the 1800s, the interpreters and the white people, they'd say, "Who are you?" And we would say, "Kanse." And all they heard was Kaw. So it got shortened to Kaw early on, and we were known as Kaw. And so even though the state of Kansas ended up taking our name from that first village on that first map in Kansas, it said Kansa on it, and they changed it to Kansa, and I'd say added an S. And
there's over 50 different ways to spell it in some of the transcripts of the early.
Yes, there's many ways to spell it and pronounce it, and it's that's special to know that your ancestors were here for centuries. And when you go up through the Flint Hills and you look out, you can almost see them out there riding on horseback. I always think about the Kaw people when I go through the Flint Hills, and when I get to the Kansas River, of course, named after the people. It's called the Kaw River also. I think of of the ancestors. I can't help but think of them. And there's always the what if, what if things had been differently?
What's the message they're telling you?
They're telling me, take care of the people. If you've got to keep the story in front of people, because if you don't, we're practically invisible in Kansas. I always tell the story of going to Jerry Shaw's class at Wichita State University on Native American spirituality. Of course, I knew Jerry, and so at the end of the class, he asked the students, how many people here know who the state of Kansas was named for? Not one of the students knew. And I'm like, oh my gosh, even more reason to tell the story, because people were being forgotten. And because Kansas took our name without asking our permission, I have to say, but the history of Kansas and the Kaw people will always be intertwined. And I think it's important for people to know that life here didn't start with European migration. There were people here when there were complex societies here, and they could speak many languages. There were, hundreds of different tribes in the United States, and you could speak some of of your neighbor's language to communicate, and you could speak French because you had traded with the French people, so you knew some French, and of course you knew Kanza, and you learned English. So they were, so the Kaw people, like I said, came here in 1600. They, the first treaty in 1825, of course, shrunk the land that they had control over from probably 200 million acres to 20 million acres. And it was just a long strip, and it had cut out just west of Lawrence and Topeka, and went south clear to almost to the foothills of the Rockies. We have a park near Council Grove. It's 3.5 miles southeast of Council Grove. It's called Aligawahu Memorial Heritage Park. Aligawahu was the last chief in Kansas before removal. In the 20s, the 1920s, they found the bones of a Kaw warrior. They decided to build a memorial to the unknown Indian in Council Grove. And it was dedicated in 1925, which was the 100th anniversary of the old Santa Fe Trail. And my grandma would have been chief at the time. When my husband and I got married, his mother gave me the program from the 1925 dedication of the memorial, and she gave me a copy of it, and I opened it up, and there was the picture of my grandma. Oh. And it said, Lucy Taya Eads, Queen of the Cause. So it wasn't until the early 2000s, though, that somebody was selling some land around the monument, and they reached out to Carnation, and Jim Pepper Henry was part of that. Of course, he was working at Carnation at the time, and so they bought 168 acres of land, and and that is what was dedicated as Ollie Oahu Memorial Heritage Park. In the 1970s, Robert Rankin was a linguist at Kansas University, and he decided that he wanted to preserve the Kansa language. So he went to Oklahoma and visited with the last speakers of the language and made many recordings of those. And if it hadn't been for that, our language would have been lost. And he worked with the Kaw people for over 40 years. And in fact, when he died, his wife gave his ashes to the Kaw people, and he is buried in the Washunga Cemetery in Newkirk. And then in the 90s, Jim Pepper Henry, again, heard about these recordings and was trying to revive the language and get a grant to revive our language and to preserve it. And so he got these recordings and brought them to Wichita, and I think at KSN maybe they made digitized versions of these. Jim talks about the story that by the 1990s there were few that could even speak the language, and our next to the last full-blood, Johnny Ray McCauley.
He was at, I'm sorry for interrupting,
go ahead.
but he was at the KSN studio when those tapes were made into CDs now.
Yes, and he could not wait to be able to hear those tapes. And so when he finally got, a disc that he could put his headphones on and listen to, he would just lay in bed and listen to him. And when he passed, they found him in bed with the headphones on, listening to those recordings.
I mean, it was all family members.
Yes, it was family members. There was a Key Cobby and a Pepper and Maudie Ray Clark, Macaulay Clark. But yes, it was his relatives. After my husband had been at Bethel College, I went to a presentation there called Indigenous Justice, Focus on Kansas. I met John Stace, Karen Kaufman-Wall, and Erica Littlewolf. And during the presentation, John had a slide that said, "Meet Ollie Oahu," and it was a picture of Washunga.
Ah, that's right.
And afterwards, I'm like, I have a small correction. And I said, "That's not Ollie Oahu, that's Chief Washunga, and I know that because he was my great-grandfather." And he's like, "Oh my gosh," he said, "I got that off of the Kansas Historical Society website." And I'm like, "Oh, see, our story doesn't get told quite the right way. To tell the Kaw story, to keep it alive, to let people know that, so many people think we're not even here anymore. They don't know who the state's named after.
They don't.
I don't know. It's really not something I sought, but it happened, and I have embraced it, I guess.